Hey everybody, this is Rebel Builder and I have another TIE Fighter MOC here for you. This is the TIE Reaper. Now if you're not familiar with the TIE Reaper, it made a couple of appearances in Rogue One. This is known as the Death Trooper Dropship. So we see it in the very beginning of the movie when they show the Ring of Kafrene, that trading outpost. It flies over the streets of that city kind of right when we first see that. And then the main appearance in the movie is in the Battle of Scarif. You see it being escorted by a couple of TIE strikers as the Death Troopers are making their way down to the beach. And then you do see kind of a shot of the underside as the ramp lowers underneath and the Death Troopers jump out to join the battle. And this MOC was particularly challenging just because of the lack of source material. You know, there weren't a lot of images from the movie, and I did find some images of a couple of toys too, and really that's all I had to go off of. And so I really struggled with this build, trying to come up with the right shape, the right geometry, and honestly there was quite a few challenges just coming up with how I was going to build the body. But once it clicked. So let me show you some of the things that I worked on. I would say the easiest thing to build was the wing section, coming up with the shape and the geometry of it. Now it's not a copy of the TIE Striker wings. You notice that, you know, the wing comes down here and then it angles back up, and it's kind of got two different angles here in the back. So that was a little bit of a challenge. And the other thing that I kind of struggled with, and you know, the more I looked at pictures and stuff, is the length and the angle of these wings here. And I have the same problem with the TIE Striker now that I really kind of study pictures of that and how it appeared in the movie. But this angle is kind of too flat, and so this front section is really a little too long. I think if I really could, I would stop the wings here and they'd kind of slope from here down to here, but you're really limited with those, you know, the Lego wing wedge pieces, you know, the 6:3 ratio. You don't have a ton of different options, so you're kind of limited. And you can tell in the TIE Striker, those front wings are longer than they should be just because of those limitations too. But like I said, the wings were the first thing that I built, or the solar panels. And you can see I got little splashes of sand blue in there. I really like how they did that on the TIE Striker, and so that's just kind of something I want to include. You know, I've got tiles going here, and they're just raised up over these, you know, modified tiles here, and kind of just came up with some details here. We'll look at that more in a minute. And you know, this section here, I like how this is not connected to the body. This is actually mounted on the underside of the solar panels here. But once I got the wings built and came up with this length, it was a matter of trying to judge how big to build the body here. I couldn't make it kind of line up with where it does in the movie with these tips of the wings here, because it would have been just too long. And there's some other geometric constraints underneath here, which we'll look at in a minute. You can see this section here slopes down. I've got some hinges here, and this opens up. We'll look at that in a second. But you can see on this section here, you know, just different levels of greebling, you know, just trying to include some details. I'm really making a lot of that up. You know, there's really not a lot that you can see in the movie. I think actually this could be more smooth. I could have included more tiles and stuff, but that's kind of the showcase or the highlight of the MOC. This section here, these big chunky solar panel connectors, and you know, the wings. That's the essence of the ship. You know, so once I kind of got that right, I knew I was going to be okay on this MOC. Take a look at the back of the main body here. You can see I have this hatch piece, and it's the same as the TIE Striker. I actually did buy another TIE Striker set. I got one on sale just so I could have some parts for this thing. You know, a lot of the sand blue and, you know, some black tiles and stuff. So I had a lot of pieces like this that I wanted to use. So I didn't necessarily want to build an open hatch here, but this actually does go all the way down. You can see these Technic lift arms here. Now that actually leads to one of my favorite aspects of this build, that I wanted to use some Technic. I wanted to challenge myself to make this stronger. So because a lot of the weight or pressure, you know, the tension in the construction of the ship is holding these wings in to the body, and the body, you can see, is kind of tall. I have these lift arms that go and kind of connect to the bottom of the ship, and I can maybe show you a little bit more of that in a minute. But I wanted to make it strong, and it all holds together, and it's actually a very sturdy build. But again, lots of greebling back here that I'm just making up. You know, these sections here, you know, that look like they kind of overhang and connect to the solar panels. That was something prominent, you know, so you can kind of see how they slope inside, you know, but really other than that was kind of just making it up. And you can also see on the inside of the solar panels here, I've got blasters here, and this whole line of bars and different pieces, you know, really kind of making this long blaster on the inside of the rails. This was fun to do, trying to just not make it too chunky, but you know, this is something you definitely can see in the ship. So I have these bars and some different Technic pieces connecting it, and you can see the hooks there holding it into the side of the solar panels. You know, that adds just a really great level of detail, I think. Now we can take a look at the front of the ship here. See, I've got some transparent black here and then some detail here, you know, just kind of giving it the look of some windows there. You know, again, I'm not sure if that's really how the ship is. And you can see I've got some blasters underneath here. I think this is a really great angle. It kind of gives you a really menacing, sloping look of the ship. And for this build, I wanted to work on my interior a little bit more. And of course, this being the drop ship of the Death Troopers, had to include some Death Troopers. So this whole section opens up, kind of like how that works. And you can see some of the construction here. You can see the TIE Fighter pilot here in front. And, you know, I kind of built the cockpit section up here. I'm not sure if that's really where it is, and I'll give you a better look here in a second. You can see that whole bay is open. And then to build the slope of this section here, you know, these are just the 3x12 wedge plates, and, you know, kind of mounted with some bricks with studs on the side. That was kind of one of the big challenges of coming up with the design of this whole body, is how was I going to do that really flat slope. And once I came up with the length and that worked out with those the geometry of those wedge plates, you know, that was one of those moments where the build really started to click, and I thought I was actually going to get it built. And you can see the Death Troopers in here. I've got 6 of them in here. It's really cool that they made that battle pack, so I picked up a couple of those. And you can see the Technic construction back here too, that, you know, these are connected to pieces on top and then down on the bottom, so the whole ship really does hold itself together. And the other thing that this does is makes the ship strong without a ton of chunky pieces. So I'm really actually quite proud of how light this ship is, and I think the part count is a lot less. You know, like with my TIE bomber, I can get kind of excessive with the parts and the weight, and you know, it's that one's really a chunky build, but I think this one is a little more light and a little more elegant. And here's a little more detail of that cockpit. You can see I built these cool kind of control yokes and just a different combination of some red lights, the slopes with computer prints on them, and some tiles. You know, I just wanted to up my game a little bit, and I like how that one turned out. And back here you can see this Death Trooper, he's kind of leaning back. That's because he's on the ramp. I'll show you how that lowers in a minute. But I included these green and red lights here, you know, kind of, you see that in military helicopters and stuff, you know, they're on red, and then when it's time to drop, the lights go to green. So I just wanted to include a little detail with that there. And it's a tight space in there, but you can see I do have 6 of those guys in there, plenty of room for them. Now here is one bad aspect of the ship, is there's all this cool building underneath that you really just don't get a good look of. You know, it's so hidden by the solar panels up here, so I'm just kind of holding it here at an awkward angle. First, there's these cannons here underneath the cockpit. I like how those turned out. But you can see the general shape of the bottom. Now, I know I don't have this 100% correct. I know that there's really kind of more of a V shape to the bottom, and then, you know, there's a little section where the ramp lowers and the Death Troopers come out, but you know, for a lot of reasons. One, Lego just being Lego, but I built this flat bottom so that I'd actually have a place to put my Death Troopers, but also is a way for the ship to stand up. You know, trying to make a V here would have been complicated. Plus, you know, you're kind of limited with geometry of slopes. But you can see I included all this greebling along this edge here. You know, I like those details. I looked at my UCS Millennium Falcon for a little inspiration on that. You know, kind of all for naught though. You don't really see it, but you can see some sand blue here. You know, just kind of different pieces there. And tiles on the side here. Really, this is a Technic piece underneath. You know, just one of those long ones, and just use some tiles to cover up the holes on that. But here underneath, this is kind of the main feature of the ship. This is the ramp here that lowers. And I didn't build any fancy mechanism, but you can see, you know, it's just on some hinges. You can see the Death Trooper there. Kind of like how these little rails turned out. And here's the back of the ship. You know, this is another angle that you don't really get a good look of. Just some slopes going here. A little detail and greebling here. And I wanted to include the design of the TIE Striker back here. You know, one, I had those parts, and two, it was just kind of a cool detail, but included a red plate here. And underneath, you can kind of see these lift arms that I have connected here, and these plates with the Technic connectors. So that's how this whole piece is connected to the side solar panel, so that these things actually do have a little flex here, and you know, this isn't going to pop off every time that one of these gets moved a little bit. And another one of those challenging shots here, but I have some Technic lift arms going sideways, and those connect into these long yellow lift arms going up and down that connect to the bottom. So it's a really sturdy structure that I'm hanging the solar panels off of. And then the sides here, the wings, have these plates again with the Technic connectors on the side. So I've got two of those, and that's all that the wings hang on to, and it's actually really sturdy. This is a pretty solid build, and it's not too heavy, and the wings don't flop around, so I'm happy about that. But I just had to throw in these big slopes here just to kind of give the wings here a place to rest, you know, just so they could get at that right angle. And because one of the main shots in the movie of the TIE Reaper, we see it being escorted by two TIE Strikers. So here, I'll give you a little size comparison. You can see it is bigger, especially in this section here. You know, those wings are deeper. I didn't want to just, you know, build the TIE Striker and then redo the middle. I wanted it to be a bigger, chunkier ship. And you can really kind of get a little more feel for the size comparison here, seeing these two side by side. Now here's a little shot of the three kinds of minifigures I included with this one. On the left is the TIE Fighter pilot that came with the TIE Striker. He's a really cool TIE Fighter pilot. And in the middle is one of my favorite minifigures, is the Death Trooper. He's kind of the fancy one with the pauldron. And then the one on the far right is the version of Death Trooper that comes with the Imperial Battle Pack. Now, at first I was kind of, you know, considering buying pauldrons for those guys. I have 4 of these now. But if you watch the movie, they have both kinds of Death Troopers in the movie, so now I'm pretty cool with having both versions. And you can see they've got clone blasters there. I didn't want to include the Star Wars blasters, and definitely not those stud shooters. Now I have to say, this ship was a challenge to build. I had quite a few false starts on it and was really feeling creatively stuck. I just couldn't get that section to kind of click in. You know, there's always a point in MOCs where you go from not knowing how you're going to build it to, you know, there's a little spark when you accomplish a section and it starts to take shape. I actually had to stop building this and work on a couple other things just to get my brain going in a different direction. And then all of a sudden, once I kind of landed on the geometry for the main cockpit section and I had the wings, all of a sudden, you know, it took off. I kind of finished the whole build really quickly, and it was a lot of fun, and I'm really happy with how this turned out. I'm surprised that this ship is so popular, considering it had about 5 seconds of screen time in Rogue One, but it is a cool build. I really like the geometry and the shape of the ship. I can see why it's popular from that sense, that it's really a cool design, and I couldn't be happier with how this turned out. It was a great challenge for me. I hope you guys like it too. But I'd love to hear your feedback, so leave me a comment down below, and please thumbs up this video. And if you're new to my channel, please hit that subscribe button. I'm working on some MOCs, and maybe I'll do a couple of reviews this summer when some new sets come out, but you don't want to miss out on that. So thanks for watching, everybody. I'll be back soon.